Before I share my story, I want to ask you something from the heart. If this testimony touches you, if you feel the weight of betrayal and the power of survival in my words, please subscribe to this channel, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from, and give this video a like. Your support means more than numbers. It means that voices like mine are heard, and that no one has to walk through pain in silence. When the unknown woman said hello into my phone, her voice spilled through the living room speakers because I had forgotten to disconnect Bluetooth after putting on the Sunday playlist. It was 1:17 in the afternoon, roast chicken still steaming on my mother's dining table, my father pouring Guaraná for the grandkids, and my husband smiling that careful smile he used whenever my family asked about his travel schedule. My phone lit up on the sideboard, buzzing once, twice, and before I could reach it, the call connected, and the house filled with breathing that was not mine. "Hello?" she said again, soft and certain, and then she said his name the way people say a secret at night. The room froze. The kids looked up. My mother set the carving knife down without a sound. My husband went pale so quickly I thought he might faint. I did not speak. I only listened. The woman laughed and asked if he had made the deposit and if he could come by later because she missed him. The silence around our table hummed like an electrical wire. I watched my husband watching me, counting how many lies he could stack inside 1 second, and I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet as if the whole house had decided to reveal its crooked foundation at the worst possible time. Years do not prepare you for a moment like that, even when those years have been heavy and precise like marked calendar pages. I met him in 2010 at a pharmacy on Westheimer in Houston, where I worked nights to help my parents with their rent while finishing community college. He bought cough drops and a thermometer and asked if I knew where he could find a decent coffee at midnight. We built a life with coins and coupons, with a second-hand couch, and the kind of stubborn hope that makes you believe good things will eventually stay. In 2013, we married at a small church with orange flowers, because orange was his mother's favorite color. In 2014, we saved $300 a month to buy a car that did not squeal at red lights. In 2016, I took a second job on weekends cleaning offices downtown so we could put away enough for a future that always felt close enough to touch. In 2017, his mother got sick and we sent money every month, $200, then $300, then $5 when the hospital bills grew like weeds. I learned to measure my days in quarters and sacrifice, always telling myself that love was just discipline wearing a warmer smile. Manipulation never arrives with a loud announcement. It walks in slowly wearing kindness, carrying a tray of reasons. He told me I was better with money so I should handle the bills. He told me my family needed me more on Sundays, so he would go to the gym and catch up later. He told me he was too tired to talk after long shifts, that I asked too many questions, that I imagined problems where there were none, that I was turning small worries into storms. I accepted those words because I wanted a quiet house and a future that made sense. I accepted them because he had a way of tilting his head and smiling sadly like a man who had seen too much disappointment to handle one more accusation. When I asked about late nights and new expenses on the card, he kissed my forehead and said contracts were coming through soon, and clients took him out to celebrate small wins. I wanted to believe him. Belief is a kind of drug that does not come with a warning label. There were numbers taped to our refrigerator that read like a prayer. $800 for rent in our first apartment, then $1,100 when we moved closer to my parents. $200 for groceries if I was careful. $300 if the kids asked for cereal with the cartoon tiger. $75 for gas, $40 for laundry, $20 for school fundraisers because I wanted my daughter to feel like her permission slips mattered. I learned the weight of everything. Shoes went on sale in March. Electricity dipped if we opened the windows at night. We bought his father a plane ticket in 2019 when he said he wanted to visit before his heart surgery, and then he canceled at the last minute. And my husband said non-refundable in a voice that carried the shape of my guilt. Love asked for patience. Love asked for budgets. Love asked for my voice to be quieter than my fear. It was not only the money. It was the impossible request that arrived disguised as duty in late 2021, when he said his friend had burned through a bad patch and needed a short loan to keep his business alive for just 2 months. $2,000. He said the friend had no one else and would pay it back with interest. He said I was the only person he could trust to help. He said our marriage would be stronger if we shared burdens like this. I can still feel the way my hand shook as I transferred the money from the emergency fund we had built one dinner at a time. When the friend did not pay a cent by spring, he said the man was embarrassed and would make it right soon. Then there was another request. Just 500 more to keep the lights on for a week. A week became a month. A month became the new rule. I began to understand that I had married a man who could place a need in front of me and make me feel cruel for questioning its origin. The discovery did not come from detective work or intuition sharpened by pain. It came from a careless morning with too many devices turned on. I had used my phone to play music through my mother's old speaker that she loved because it made the house feel like a party even when we were just eating bread and butter at the table where she ironed shirts. I set my phone on the sideboard and forgot it there when the doorbell rang, and my sister arrived with a bowl of rice and beans and a story about a neighbor who kept feeding stray cats. We passed plates. We poured soda. We kissed the kids and told them to stop running indoors. The phone buzzed. The speaker accepted the call like an eager friend. "Hello," she said, her voice lighting up the ceiling as if it had always lived there. "Is this him?" she asked. And then she said my husband's name like a promise. She asked if he could stop by before 2 because she had something to show him. She said the deposit came through and she loved the way he always kept his word. My father looked at me the way fathers do when they want to fix a thing they cannot even name yet. My mother pressed her fingers together as if she were trying to hold back time. My husband's fork clinked against his plate. I counted 3 breaths, and then I picked up the phone and said, "You have the wrong number." The lie that followed had a smell. It smelled like rain on hot concrete, like something that should have cooled us down but only made the air heavier. He said it was a client with a bad phone signal. He said deposits meant commissions and commissions meant our future. He said the woman's name so quickly I knew he had practiced the sound of it. He reached for my hand and I pulled it back, not out of anger but out of the need to feel my fingers belonged to me. My daughter asked if everything was okay, and I said yes, in a voice that did not sound like my own. My son returned to his drawing, a car that looked like a rectangle with hope. Lunch continued because hunger does not care about betrayal. I chewed slowly and tasted metal. The room tried to return to normal, to that soft buzz of family noise. But the words continued bouncing from wall to wall. Deposit. Stop by. Love the way he keeps his word. Later in the kitchen, he asked me to trust him just a little longer. He said he would explain everything once the deal closed. He said people who love each other do not interrogate each other in front of their families. He said I should not embarrass him. He said my mother never liked him and would use anything to tear us apart. There it was again, the quiet pressure that turned suspicion into apology. I heard myself say, "I am sorry," and I hated how easily the words arrived. He kissed my forehead and told me to smile for the kids. The house smelled like cinnamon and old photographs. My mother wiped the counter in small circles that betrayed her nerves. My father offered me a seat like a man offering a life raft. The afternoon slid toward evening, and I counted the hours until I could ask my phone for the truth. When the children fell asleep on the couch to a movie they had already seen twice, I went into the bedroom and opened the call logs. There she was, a Houston number with a pattern like a nursery rhyme. There were weeks of calls, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 38, always just before he said he was driving home from the gym. There were transfers I could not explain. 200, 99, 150, small sums that add up to a story if you let them. I made a list on a notepad the way you make a grocery list when you are determined not to forget milk again. Dates, times, amounts. I felt oddly calm, like a person who has survived the accident and now sits on the curb counting heartbeats for proof. The twist came in the form of a screenshot sent by a friend who never gossips unless she believes it will save you. "Do you know her?" she asked, attaching a photo of the same number paired with a name I recognized from 2 years ago. The friend of a friend whose fundraiser I had shared without thinking. A woman who posted about rent increases and a broken car and the cost of daycare that never stops rising. The same woman my husband once described as someone you should not judge because life is complicated and people make bad decisions when they are broke. My skin went cold as I scrolled her public profile and found a picture from a motel parking lot with a caption and a heart that meant nothing to the world and everything to me. I felt the shape of his lies expand until they pressed on every wall inside me. It was not just infidelity. It was sustenance. It was a parallel home made of cheap rooms and paid attention and the money I squeezed from coupons and late nights. I stood in the doorway of our living room and watched him sleep on the couch with one shoe still on, television light blinking across his face. He looked younger when he slept, like the man who asked me for coffee in a pharmacy with a sick mother and a trembling smile. I wanted to shake him awake and demand a ledger of every hour he had stolen, but a quiet voice in me said, "Wait. Let the morning appear. Let the truth arrive on its own feet." I turned off the speaker on my mother's old system so nothing else could call us by accident. I placed my phone face down and felt the weight of it like a stone that knew all the names of the river. I thought about the woman's voice saying deposit and love in the same breath, and I wondered how many different meanings a single word can carry before it breaks. The morning after the call, I woke before the alarm, my body restless with the taste of betrayal still lingering in my mouth. The house was quiet, blinds half open, letting in a pale line of light across the carpet. He was still asleep, his breathing slow, one arm draped over his chest like he had nothing to hide. I stood in the doorway with my phone in my hand, staring at the contact history, the dates, the times, the evidence carved into digital stone. It felt like I was holding a loaded gun without knowing if I had the strength to pull the trigger. My hands trembled as I scrolled, but my mind was strangely clear. Every late night, every excuse, every missing dollar, it was all here, unfiltered, undeniable. For years I had accepted his words as truth, but here was truth unmasked and brutal. I walked to the kitchen, set the kettle to boil, and waited for the sound to fill the silence. My chest rose and fell in short, sharp bursts. I thought about the sacrifices that had built this home. My mother sewing clothes for my children, me staying late at jobs that drained me, my father giving up weekends to fix things we could not afford to replace. And all the while, he had been feeding another life with the scraps of my devotion. The anger that rose inside me was different from the quiet suspicion I had carried for years. This was raw, bright, and dangerous. It pulsed in my veins like fire. When he finally stirred and entered the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, pretending to stretch like a man who had earned his rest, I could hardly look at him. He kissed my cheek without hesitation, poured himself coffee, and asked what was wrong. His voice was casual, too casual, the practiced tone of someone who has spent years polishing lies until they sound like truth. I asked him directly about the woman. I said her name aloud, a name that felt sour on my tongue. For a moment he froze, his eyes darting toward the floor, and then came the performance I already expected. Denial, confusion, irritation. He said I was imagining things, that I had misunderstood, that people sometimes speak carelessly and it means nothing. But there was one detail he could not control. My phone still held the call log. I placed it in front of him on the table, screen bright with numbers and dates that did not care for his excuses. He looked at it, then at me, and for the first time in years I saw something unguarded in his face. Fear. Not the fear of being wronged, but the fear of being caught. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then whispered that he had reasons, that life had been harder than I could understand, that she had been there for him when he felt alone. His words fell like stones into a well too deep to fill. I thought of the nights I had worked overtime, of the money I had counted coin by coin, of the times he had asked me to trust him just a little longer. I thought of my children asleep in the other room, their innocence still intact. I thought of my parents, who had watched me build a marriage with both hands while my husband was tearing it down in secret. And then I realized something sharp and final. This was not a mistake. This was a pattern, a design, a choice repeated so many times it had become his truth. I did not scream. I did not cry. My silence was louder than any explosion could have been. I told him to leave. My voice was steady, flat, the kind of voice that brooks no negotiation. He pleaded. He reached for me. He said the children would suffer. He said I could not survive without him. The manipulation returned, desperate now, stripped of charm. But I saw him clearly at last. He was not the man who had asked me for coffee all those years ago. He was not the man I had sacrificed for. He was a stranger wearing his skin. When he finally left that morning, the door closing with a sound that seemed to echo for minutes, I sat at the table and stared at the empty chair he used to fill. The house was heavy with silence, but it was a silence I could own. My reflection in the window looked older, worn, but also free in a way I had not felt in years. The betrayal had burned through me like fire through paper, leaving ashes, yes, but also space. Space for air, space for truth, space for me. I thought the hardest part would be the confrontation, but I was wrong. The hardest part came after, when the house carried his absence like a wound that would not close. At night, the silence stretched wider than the walls, swallowing every familiar sound. The rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway, the scrape of his chair on the kitchen floor, the hum of his car pulling into the driveway at odd hours. I told myself I should feel relief, that freedom was finally here, but the truth was more complicated. Betrayal does not simply cut you once. It bleeds into every corner of your life, staining the memories you thought were safe. I replayed our wedding vows in my head, the promises he made beneath the dim lights of the church in 2013, and wondered how much of it had been real. My chest tightened when I remembered the countless nights I had carried both the burden of bills and the burden of faith, whispering to myself that love was worth sacrifice. Now I saw how he had taken that sacrifice and twisted it into a currency for his own deceit. The children noticed before I said a word. My daughter asked why Daddy's shoes weren't by the door, her voice small, as if she already knew the answer but wanted me to deny it. My son, younger and still wrapped in the soft edges of childhood, asked if Daddy was working again. I swallowed the truth because the truth was a knife they were too young to hold. I told them Daddy needed some time, that sometimes grown-ups have to figure things out. They nodded, but I could see the storm forming behind their eyes, questions piling up like bricks too heavy for their small shoulders. That night, when they finally slept, I sat alone in the living room with the bills spread across the coffee table. The numbers stared back at me with the same cold honesty as the call log had. Rent due in 12 days, credit card balance higher than it had ever been, savings drained by the impossible requests he had dressed as duties. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of it all pressing directly on me, without the illusion of partnership. I went to my mother's the next morning. She opened the door before I could knock twice, her face already carrying the knowledge I hadn't spoken aloud. Mother's no. She made coffee, strong and bitter, and placed her hand on mine as if anchoring me to the earth. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," she said. The words struck me harder than any confession he had ever made, because I realized how long I had been living in isolation, even surrounded by people. I told her everything, from the first suspicious nights to the voice on the speaker, every lie, every sacrifice, every impossible demand. She listened without interruption, her eyes fierce but steady. When I finally fell silent, she said something simple but unforgettable. Sometimes losing someone is the only way to find yourself again. Her words lingered as I began to rebuild. Day by day, I shifted from asking why he had done this to asking what I would do next. I found work that gave me hours I could manage with the children. I called the bank and explained the situation, negotiating payments instead of letting them crush me. I sold what we didn't need, the extra television, his old collection of sneakers, even the car he had insisted we buy on credit. Each step felt like tearing off a piece of the past, painful, but necessary. I started to sleep again, not the heavy, restless sleep of denial, but the fragile, light sleep of someone beginning to heal. What surprised me most was the shift inside my own voice. For years it had been quiet, subdued, afraid of confrontation. Now, when I spoke, I heard strength edging into my words, even when I didn't intend it. I told the children we would be okay, and I believed it more each time I said it. I told my father I could handle the bills, and I saw pride flicker across his tired face. I told myself I deserved better, and for the first time in a long time, I did not flinch at the sound of my own conviction. The memory of that woman's voice still surfaces sometimes, like a haunting echo I cannot erase. But instead of pain, it now carries a strange kind of clarity. Her hello shattered the illusion I had lived under for years, and in that shattering, I found a chance to rebuild something real. The discovery was brutal, yes, but it was also the beginning of a truth I could finally claim as mine. I understood now that love is not supposed to feel like erasure, not supposed to demand silence as proof of loyalty. Love is not supposed to drain you until you are a shadow of yourself. And so, sitting at the same table where it all fell apart, I wrote a list, not of expenses or debts, not of lies or betrayals, but of what I wanted to carry forward. Honesty, dignity, a future where my children learned that strength is not in enduring manipulation, but in walking away from it. A future where my own reflection did not scare me with its exhaustion, but smiled back with something I had almost forgotten existed: hope. The weeks that followed unfolded like a long corridor filled with doors I was terrified to open. Every door seemed to hide a memory I could no longer trust. The birthday parties he promised to plan but left to me, the trips he swore were for work, the nights he claimed exhaustion but smelled faintly of perfume I didn't own. Each recollection became a sharp edge, cutting away at the image of the marriage I had built in my mind. Yet with every cut, I began to see something clearer. The woman I had been before him, before sacrifice blurred into servitude, before love became obedience. It startled me how much of myself I had lost inside his narrative, as though my identity had been locked in a room he alone carried the key to. At work, colleagues noticed the change in me before I did. My posture shifted, my voice steadied, my eyes stopped scanning the clock for his arrival or his call. One afternoon, a coworker asked if I had started sleeping better, and I almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. Better? Not yet. But differently, yes. Sleep no longer felt like hiding from the truth. It was rest earned, however fragile. In the quiet hours, I began journaling, pouring years of silence into words I had never allowed myself to speak. The pages filled quickly with details. The first time he asked me to lend money to a friend, the night he disappeared after promising to tuck in the children, the exact tone he used when telling me I was imagining things. Writing became a mirror, and in it I saw not just his cruelty, but also my endurance. The family carried the wound too, though each in their own way. My mother, fierce but tender, checked on me daily, her voice grounding me when the nights grew heavy. My father, more reserved, offered help without words, fixing a leaky faucet, repairing a loose chair leg, bringing over bread he baked at dawn. Their presence reminded me that love could be steady, unselfish, and wordless. My children adjusted slowly, their questions circling closer to the truth. I decided honesty, measured but real, was better than silence. I told them their father had made mistakes, that he had hurt me, and that we needed to protect our home from more harm. They cried, they asked if he would come back, and I answered with the only truth I knew. We are going to be okay. Bills remained, stubborn as shadows. I faced them one by one, learning that survival has a rhythm of its own. Rent paid late, but paid. Groceries stretched with creativity. I discovered recipes my grandmother once taught me. Rice with beans seasoned not with abundance, but with patience. Somehow it tasted like resilience. Every time I crossed off a due date from the calendar, I felt a small victory. Not because the burden was gone, but because it no longer belonged to both of us. It belonged to me, and I was still standing. The strangest twist arrived when the other woman reached out. A message, cautious and trembling, appeared one night on my phone. She said she hadn't known about me, about the children, about the years I had poured into him. She said he told her stories, painted himself as a man trapped in a loveless home, carrying the weight of a wife who didn't understand him. Her words hit me like cold water, not because I believed them, but because I recognized the pattern. He had rewritten me to her just as he had rewritten her to me. Lies were his language, and we were both just chapters in the same false book. I did not reply. Some conversations are traps, designed to reopen wounds. Silence, I realized, can also be an answer. The reflection came late one evening, when the children were asleep and the house smelled of lavender from the candle I lit to calm my nerves. I sat on the couch he once sprawled across and let the weight of the past year sink into me. Betrayal had tried to define me, but it had also forced me to rediscover myself. I was not just the woman he deceived. I was the woman who survived it, who faced down lies with evidence, who protected her children, who carried the weight alone and still stood. My scars were not shame. They were proof. Looking back, I understood that the phone call was not an accident. It was a revelation, a breaking point written into the fabric of my story. Without it, I might still be walking in circles, blind to the truth, silenced by manipulation. Painful as it was, it set me free. I thought of my mother's words again. Sometimes losing someone is the only way to find yourself, and realized she had been right all along. I had lost him, but in the ashes of that loss, I had found something greater. I had found me. There was a moment, weeks later, when I caught myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. It happened at the park while watching my son race his bike down a slope too steep for comfort, his little legs pumping furiously, his face lit up with fearless joy. My daughter was beside me, rolling her eyes at her brother's recklessness but secretly smiling too. The sound of my own laughter startled me. It didn't feel borrowed or forced, and it wasn't wrapped in tension. It was mine. That's when I realized how much of my life I had been holding back, dimming my own light to fit into the shadows of a man who thrived on control. It was as though betrayal had stripped me raw, but, in that rawness, I had finally uncovered something pure, the possibility of happiness without him. I started noticing other small victories, waking up without dread, paying a bill on time with money I had earned alone, cooking a meal and finding it tasted better, maybe because it was seasoned with freedom instead of resentment. My body felt lighter, my mind clearer. I began walking in the evenings, headphones in, the city humming around me, and each step felt like reclaiming ground that had never truly been his to take. It was not just survival anymore. It was the beginning of living. Still, there were nights when the memories tried to crawl back, uninvited. His voice whispering promises in 2013 at the altar, his hand pressing mine in 2016 when he swore things would get better, his text in 2021 saying he needed just a little more time. Those echoes arrived like ghosts, haunting me with the illusion of what could have been. But instead of breaking me, they became reminders. Reminders of the distance I had traveled, of the lies I had survived, of the woman I refused to be again. I learned that healing was not forgetting. It was remembering without allowing the memory to chain you. The family still carried their own weight in silence. My father avoided speaking his name, choosing instead to pour his love into actions, dropping off bags of fruit from the market, fixing the children's toys with the steady patience of a man who knows healing comes from hands as much as from words. My mother remained my anchor, reminding me daily that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the decision to keep moving, one breath at a time. Their quiet presence made me believe that maybe love, the real kind, is less about passion and more about staying. One evening, while organizing old boxes, I found a letter I had written to myself in 2010 before I married him. It was a list of dreams: finish school, travel to Mexico to visit my grandmother's village, open a small bakery one day. I had forgotten those words, buried them under years of sacrifice and manipulation. Holding that letter, I felt tears rise, not of sorrow, but of recognition. That young woman still lived inside me. She had been waiting all along for me to remember her. The reflection grew sharper with time. Betrayal had tried to convince me that I was broken, unworthy, replaceable. But step by step, I discovered the opposite. I was resilient. I was capable. I was enough. The wound was deep, yes, but it had not destroyed me. Instead, it carved space for new beginnings, for a life no longer defined by silence or fear. And so, when I tucked my children into bed that night and kissed their foreheads, I made a promise, not the kind whispered at an altar under false pretenses, but one etched into my very bones. I promised them a home filled with honesty. I promised them laughter that was real, not painted over cracks. I promised them a mother who would not vanish inside lies, but who would stand, present and unbroken. For the first time, I believed I could keep that promise. The call that destroyed everything had once felt like the end of my life, but as the seasons shifted, I realized it had been the beginning of another. By the time autumn painted the leaves outside my window, I no longer woke up searching for traces of him. His absence had turned from a wound into a space I could finally fill with myself. The house no longer echoed with his lies. Instead, it carried the soft rhythm of our new routines. Breakfasts with laughter, homework spread across the table, music playing from my phone without fear of voices bleeding through. There were still difficult days. Days when bills stacked too high, when exhaustion threatened to pull me under, when I felt the sharp sting of loneliness at night. But even in those moments, there was a difference. The pain was mine now, not borrowed from his deceptions. It was honest, and honesty, I learned, carries its own strange comfort. I would rather face a hard truth alone than live inside a soft lie with company. The turning point came unexpectedly during a family gathering months later. We were at my mother's again, the same house where the truth had once spilled so violently through the speakers. This time, the air was lighter. My children played with their cousins, chasing each other around the table, while my father laughed at a story my sister told. At one point, I looked around the room and realized the absence that had once felt unbearable had now become invisible. We were whole without him. Life had not collapsed. In fact, it had expanded, making room for peace we didn't even know we had been missing. I thought of the woman who had answered my phone that day. I wondered if she ever discovered the full extent of his lies, if she ever saw through the mask he wore so carefully. But my curiosity faded quickly. She no longer mattered. He no longer mattered. What mattered was that the truth had found its way to me, and though it burned, it set me free. The betrayal that had once threatened to crush me had instead rebuilt me into someone stronger than I had ever imagined. Late at night, when the children were asleep and the world was quiet, I often sat with a cup of tea and allowed myself to reflect. I thought about the years I had lost to manipulation, the money I had scraped together only to see it vanish into someone else's story, the nights I had swallowed questions to keep peace. And then I thought about who I had become. I was no longer the woman who waited by the door, heart tight with suspicion. I was no longer the wife who apologized for asking too much. I was no longer the mother who whispered lies of reassurance to herself just to get through another day. I was me, raw, scarred, but alive in a way I hadn't been in years. The reflection in the mirror no longer frightened me with its weariness. It inspired me with its survival. And survival, I realized, is its own kind of victory. By the time winter arrived, I knew the betrayal would always be a chapter in my story, but it would not be the ending. The ending was mine to write. It would be filled with laughter I didn't question, with truths I didn't fear, with children who grew up knowing that even in the face of lies, their mother chose dignity over silence. The phone call had revealed the worst of him, but in doing so, it had uncovered the best of me. Spring arrived like a quiet promise, soft light stretching through the windows and touching corners of the house that had long felt heavy with shadow. For the first time in years, I felt that light inside me too. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden burst of joy, but a slow thaw, the way frozen ground begins to loosen after months of silence. I noticed it in the way I smiled at strangers, in the way my children's laughter no longer carried an undertone of worry, in the way I could finally breathe without the weight of his presence pressing on my chest. Life took on a rhythm that was ours alone. Mornings became a rush of cereal bowls, backpacks, and uneven ponytails before school. Evenings were filled with homework sprawled across the kitchen table and stories told beneath blankets. I was tired, always tired, but it was an honest exhaustion, one I could accept because it came from effort and care, not from carrying someone else's lies. Every small accomplishment, paying a bill on time, cooking a meal from scratch, watching my daughter master a difficult math problem, Felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I thought had been lost forever. Yet, healing was not linear. There were days when I stumbled. Nights when I scrolled through old photos and asked myself if any of it had been real. I sometimes woke from dreams where he was still beside me, and for a fleeting second, the old comfort tempted me before the truth rushed back in like cold water. On those days, I reminded myself that remembering the pain did not mean I had failed to move forward. It meant I was still human, still capable of feeling, still alive. One afternoon, while walking through the local market, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She hugged me tightly, commented on how strong I looked, and then lowered her voice to say she had heard whispers about what happened. My chest tightened, but before I could shrink into shame, she added, "I'm glad you found your way out." Her words stayed with me long after I left the market. I realized then that I no longer owed anyone explanations. The story was mine, and it was not a badge of failure, but of survival. The children adjusted in ways that amazed me. My daughter began writing stories, filling notebooks with heroes who always discovered the truth in time. My son grew more protective, slipping his small hand into mine whenever we walked together, as though silently promising to keep me safe. Watching them adapt, I understood that resilience could be inherited, that they were learning from me not how to avoid pain, but how to rise from it. That knowledge gave me strength on the hardest nights. It was during one of those nights, while folding laundry in the stillness of the living room, that I allowed myself to dream again. Not of him, not of us, but of me. I thought of the letter I had found, the one written by the younger version of myself, and I began to rewrite it in my head. Finish school. Travel to the places my grandmother once spoke of. Open that bakery with the smell of fresh bread spilling into the street. They no longer felt like distant fantasies. They felt possible. The betrayal had not stolen those dreams forever. It had simply delayed them. As the days grew longer, I carried a quiet determination inside me. The woman who once whispered apologies for asking too much had become the woman who set boundaries without guilt. The woman who once bent beneath the weight of manipulation had become the woman who stood tall, steady, unshaken. And though scars remained, they no longer marked me as broken. They marked me as whole. Summer came with heat so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Yet inside me there was a coolness, a steadiness that I had not known for years. By then, his shadow had faded from our home. The children no longer asked where he was. Their lives had found a new balance, filled with routines that belonged to us alone. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would watch them sleep and wonder if they would remember the night everything changed. The night a stranger's voice cracked our world open. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. But what I wanted most was for them to remember not the betrayal, but the rebuilding that followed. I found work that suited me better. Steady hours at a local bakery where the mornings began before sunrise, where the smell of bread wrapped itself around me like comfort. At first, it was just a job, a way to pay bills. But slowly, it became more than that. I remembered the dream I once wrote down in 2010 about opening a bakery of my own. Each loaf I baked, each customer I greeted, reminded me that dreams could be resurrected even after years of silence. My boss noticed my dedication, and one day she said, "You should think about running a place yourself someday." The words made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition. That possibility was still alive. The more I worked, the more I understood that survival was not only about cutting away what was toxic, it was about planting something new in its place. Bills were still a battle, but each month I faced them with a little more confidence. I learned to stretch not just money, but hope. My mother would come by with fruit from the market, my father with tools to fix what was broken, and together we built a network of care that had nothing to do with lies or manipulation. It was real. It was enough. Occasionally, I still heard whispers of him. Friends mentioned seeing him, always with someone new, always carrying the same polished charm that once fooled me. The news no longer pierced me. Instead, it reminded me of what I had escaped. I no longer carried the burden of his choices. He was a story I had closed, a chapter that no longer defined the book. The children and I began new traditions. Saturday mornings at the park, where laughter carried further than regret. Sunday dinners with my parents, where the table was filled not with secrets, but with simple food and honest conversation. Even small things, hanging new curtains, painting the kitchen a soft yellow, became symbols of a life reclaimed. The house no longer felt like a place of betrayal. It felt like ours again. And then came the moment I never expected. One evening, as the sun dipped low, my daughter handed me a drawing she had made. It showed the three of us, her brother and me, standing under a bright sky. She had written in uneven letters at the bottom, "We are safe." I held the paper and felt tears slip down my cheeks, not from sorrow but from a flood of gratitude. Safe. That was what I had built out of ruin. That was what mattered most. I realized then that forgiveness was not something I owed him. It was something I owed myself. Forgiveness did not mean excusing his lies or erasing the pain. It meant refusing to let his choices poison the rest of my life. It meant stepping into tomorrow without carrying yesterday's chains. And so I whispered the words into the quiet of my room. Not for him, but for me. I forgive, and I am free. By the time autumn returned, I no longer measured my life by what he had taken, but by what I had rebuilt. The woman who once whispered excuses for his absence had grown into someone who stood tall in her own truth. I could see it in the way I moved through the world, no longer shrinking, no longer second-guessing every word that left my mouth. There was a certainty in me that had not existed before, a quiet power born not from victory, but from survival. The lies he told had left scars, yes, but scars are proof of healing. I carried them openly now, not as marks of shame, but as reminders of what I had overcome. There were still moments when his memory flickered across my mind. His smile in the early years, the sound of his laugh before it soured with deceit. But those moments no longer controlled me. They arrived, they passed, and I remained whole. What once felt like a wound had become a story, and stories, unlike wounds, can be carried without bleeding. The children flourished in ways that filled me with awe. My son grew bolder, his laughter louder, as if the weight of secrets no longer pressed down on his small shoulders. My daughter found her voice in writing, filling notebook after notebook with worlds of her own making, where truth always triumphed over lies. Watching them grow without the constant shadow of manipulation taught me something profound. Healing is not only personal, it is generational. The freedom I fought for was shaping their futures, too. I often thought back to that day, the call that shattered everything. For a long time, I had seen it as the cruelest twist of fate. But as the years began to turn, I understood it differently. That call had been a revelation, a brutal gift wrapped in pain. It had forced me to see what I had been unwilling to admit, to face the reality I had hidden from myself. Without it, I might still be living in the prison of his lies. With it, I was free. One evening, while sitting on the porch with my mother, I told her I was grateful. She looked at me confused until I explained. I was grateful not for the betrayal itself, but for what it had revealed. Grateful that I had been given the chance to reclaim my life before it was too late. Grateful that the truth, however cruel, had arrived when it did. My mother squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "That's what strength looks like, my girl." And she was right. Strength is not in pretending the pain never happened. Strength is in carrying it, learning from it, and then laying it down so it no longer defines you. Strength is looking at the ruins of what you once thought was unbreakable and deciding to build something better from the pieces. Now, when I look forward, I do so with hope. Hope not built on promises from someone else's mouth, but on the steady foundation of my own resilience. I have dreams again, real ones. I picture a bakery of my own, the smell of fresh bread spilling into the street, my children helping in the mornings before school. I picture travel, laughter, new love one day, not because I need it, but because I choose it. The past will always be a part of me, but it no longer defines me. I am not the woman betrayed at a family table. I am not the wife silenced by manipulation. I am not the shadow of his choices. I am me, scarred, yes, but stronger, freer, and finally whole. Winter settled in again, crisp air filling the mornings and long nights wrapping the house in silence. But this time the silence was gentle, not suffocating. It was no longer the kind of silence that hid lies behind closed doors. It was the kind of silence that comes when peace finally replaces chaos. I would sit with a cup of tea, steam rising in the dim light of the kitchen, and feel the weight of all that had happened resting quietly beside me, no longer crushing me. The betrayal that once tore me open had transformed into something else entirely, a marker of the moment I chose to begin again. Looking back, I could trace the years of sacrifice like lines carved into stone, the overtime hours, the nights I went without, the countless ways I made myself smaller so he could seem larger. I had given pieces of myself away until I barely recognized the reflection staring back at me. But the truth, revealed in the most brutal way, forced me to stop. It made me look at what I had left and ask myself who I wanted to become. That answer, I realized, had nothing to do with him. It had everything to do with me. The reflection was sharp. I had allowed manipulation to masquerade as love. I had believed that loyalty meant silence. I had mistaken survival for happiness. But betrayal stripped all of that away, leaving me raw, exposed, and strangely free. And in that freedom, I discovered that love, real love, was not about giving until you vanished. It was about standing whole, unbroken, seen. I thought of the night the woman's voice slipped through my mother's speaker, a voice that revealed the truth he had hidden for years. At first, I cursed that moment, wished it had never happened. But now I saw it for what it was, the crack in the foundation that exposed the rot beneath. Without that call, I might still be building on something destined to collapse. With it, I had the chance to clear the ground and build something new. The unexpected twist was that betrayal, which I once thought would define me forever, had instead delivered me back to myself. It gave me the strength to raise my children in honesty, the courage to dream again, the wisdom to recognize manipulation before it could take root. I was not broken. I was remade. And so I carry this story not as a confession of weakness, but as a testament of survival. The phone call that exposed his cruelty became the doorway to my own liberation. I no longer fear silence. I no longer fear truth. I no longer fear being alone. Because I am not alone. I have my children, my family, and most importantly, I have myself. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this. Sometimes the worst day of your life is the day you are finally set free. And freedom, no matter how it arrives, is worth everything.